If we move down the list, we've got what looks like some of my favorite numbers to look at, which are numbers taken from a lipid profile. So we've got a ratio here of triglycerides to HDL. We see HDL cholesterol, we see LDL cholesterol. Everybody knows HDL cholesterol is called good cholesterol. LDL cholesterol is called bad cholesterol. I see triglycerides on here. Now, you're missing one that seems to be very important, Dana. Why did you not list your total cholesterol?
I am so glad that you asked, Casey, because let me just put this in very scientific terms because it's silly.
Thank you.
Okay? It's silly unless you want to sell a medication. And then it's a really effective tool.
Yep.
Okay? So that I think that summarizes it if you want to go into more detail for your listeners, but for me, I think it's about there's more detail in terms of lipids and cholesterol you want to look at, but for most people looking at the three that we're talking about here, I think, and looking at healthy ratios. Okay, ratios, not good bad, as maybe I sensed more than a little sarcasm there, but but your point is very, very valid, I think. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I hope that the listener will go and look up silly. It's a highly technical term. You might not be able to understand this really technical mumbo jumbo medical speak. But you're right. And I think we have to keep in mind that when we started experiencing heart attacks like 200 years ago, heart attacks really weren't a thing. They were exceedingly rare. They were increasing in the 1950s. We needed to figure it out. We started to notice that there was an accumulation in people's arteries that included cholesterol and other things that turned into the thing that we blamed. We have to remember that back then we were really new in even being able to measure cholesterol, and we didn't even know there was LDL and HDL cholesterol when we started demonizing cholesterol itself. It was just cholesterol. The learning later that there were different factions and subfractions and all that stuff, that came much, much, much later. And so in the beginning, when people said cholesterol is bad, they were talking about all cholesterol, and the lower it was, just the better, which we all know is absolute nonsense garbage and is very, very silly. The markers that are more important you've included here. So triglyceride to HDL ratio. I don't know how you feel about this marker in particular. For me, that if you don't have any other numbers on this page besides the insulin, I would say this ratio tells me pretty much everything I need to know about your metabolic health. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree with that. And again, I learned that from Benjamin Bigman, and I think that is a really easy one for people. You just take your triglycerides divided by the HDL, and it's going to give you a number. And depending on your heritage, can impact this. Some people will say it should be less than 1.8, that ratio, or less than 2. Maybe some people might even go a little lower than that. I'm just averaging. I'm just going to say, look, a really optimal range would be less than 1.8. So mine wasn't bad, but again, I want to emphasize that I went years with eating real food and doing really, really well before the pandemic, and so that helped me in terms of my re-addiction. But I went from 1.61 during this 4-month period down to 1.09, and that's again a significant reduction. And this is really easy because for the most part, any standard lab that your physician's gonna pull in terms of your blood work, you're gonna get HDL and you're gonna get triglycerides. So you can easily adapt this ratio and get an idea. And what that really is looking at is an indication of potential insulin resistance, which is, so if your physician said, oh, we can't afford to test your fasted insulin, which is, you know, they should be able. It's
Silly
not.
again,
It's
silly.
silly. I was going to use that, but I didn't want to overuse it. But thank you. I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did. Absolutely. But this is really easy for people to be able to do, and they don't even need their physician to do it. They can just take those markers and divide them up. It's really easy, and you can come up with that. So you want it to be, let's just say, even if it's less than 2.0,
Yeah.
I think that's I completely agree with you on that ratio and yeah, how significant it is.
I would be very happy with those numbers. And you made a good point too, that like if you can't afford more advanced blood work, maybe this is again like a gateway where you can get a lipid profile. I was doing these on clients. They were paying like $30 and it's just a little finger stick, should be
Yeah,
easily accessible and inexpensive. That can at least tell you whether you need to do additional testing. And your numbers look great. One thing that people are normally surprised by is triglycerides. So triglycerides would be like the liquid fat that's traveling around in the body. And what we notice is people that start eating more fat and eating less carbohydrates, their triglycerides actually drop, which is a little counterintuitive because you would think like if they're eating, ribeyes cooked in butter, you would imagine that the fat in the blood would actually go up, and it really doesn't. It tends to drop. And that is an
yeah,
understanding of how we actually make fat. Fat does not make you fat. It is turning carbohydrates into fat in the liver when you
in the
consume them.
liver,
That is
in the
what people
liver.
need to concern themselves
Yes,
about. Yeah.
absolutely. Sorry to interrupt you. I just got enthusiastic about what you were saying, but yeah, absolutely. And that's why we'll get down to it. But when you look at the implications of fatty liver, and when I was emphasizing talking about the carnivore diet and visceral fat, you can assume that if you've got a thick belly, okay, whether you're obese or whether you fall into that, what's called skinny fat, where you kind of don't have a lot of lean muscle, but you get that haunch that's pretty significant, you're probably going to have fatty liver. So that's a big consideration, and that is going to be correlated to those high triglycerides. So I think you summed it up pretty well there. I mean, my triglycerides went from 100, which still is not, I really, I thought it was going to be a lot worse. I really did. I was kind
Pretty
of
good.
happy with that. I was kind of happy with that number, but it went down to 84,
Yeah.
so which is no surprise. Again, when you look at all the people that are lining up with the benefits results from the carnivore diet, if they are looking at blood work, these are not surprising numbers at all.
Mhm. No, not at all. And we see that again, quote unquote, bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol went up 136. So already kind of borderline high to 155, which is definitely high. Most doctors would be stunned and they would want you on a statin. Does that high LDL cholesterol concern you at all?
No, not at all. In fact, where I'm at, I do think sometime eventually, if you look at my ratios to answer your question, and I have a good balance between HDL, LDL, and triglycerides, and where the LDL, at least through the historic eyes of evaluating LDL, went from 136 to 155, as you said. But I look at that as a sign of vitality.
Agreed.
Okay, and when you look at and again, your sarcasm in terms of talking about good and bad cholesterol, HDL and LDL. Look, cholesterol is essential. Like it's vital. Like you die without it, right? Now it is the ratio, absolutely. Don't get me wrong, but I think it's involved in hormone production and LDL. There's a lot of information starting to maybe surface a little bit more too and support, because it has a lot to do with supporting our body's response to inflammation. And I
Absolutely.
touch on that. Don't ask me a lot of questions about it. I haven't researched that. I haven't personally studied that aspect, but I have seen enough study headlines to know that I think there are implications around that. So I am totally cool with my ratios and where my LDL cholesterol's at, especially with my history of autoimmune issues, and I
Yeah.
think that there's starting to be some information and studies starting to come out in terms of people with low LDL are not doing that well in terms of
Yeah.
longevity and inflammation. So
Yeah, absolutely. No, there's some really cool research out with people that have familial hypercholesterolemia, which means they're born with a genetic disease where their cholesterol is really, really high. And up until they've got a higher mortality rate until they turn about 40, and then they
yeah,
reach a crossover point. So if you have this condition, a really unfortunate condition, kids die of heart attacks at like age 6. It's really tragic. But again, if you
yeah,
make it to a certain disease, they actually survive much better than the general population, and they're like disproportionately protected from other diseases that people die from, like cancer, hypertension, dementia. And so it's interesting that that genetic condition in the beginning of your life isn't great, but if you survive past a certain point, you're even more protected. And I think there's great evidence that LDL cholesterol in particular is really good for things like immunity. You mentioned inflammation. I would be really happy with that number